We want to talk to you about an idea that there's a bank, municipally owned. LA County, LA City has decided, it's LA City that has decided to have own their own bank, right?
That's correct. It's the city of LA.
Can you explain to us what they're doing? What's going on?
Yeah, so what Los Angeles is doing is their city council voted earlier this month to authorize their legislative unit to essentially go out and seek proposals and bids for what a plan would entail for the city to establish its own municipal run bank. So essentially, the city of LA is taking the first steps towards the creation of a public bank. Now, there's a long way to go from, putting out the RFP and doing the study process, but that is the first step that municipalities do need to take to go that route of setting up their own bank.
So what does that mean? Municipally owned bank. Does the city of LA would own it? Would it belong to the city of LA? How would it work?
Right. I mean, technically, it'll be taxpayer funded institution. So, the city doesn't technically own anything. It's taxpayer money that would be funding it. And then presumably it would be run by city officials. So I think those are probably details that would come forward when the city would formally put forward their proposal of what their bank would look like. But presumably as a city run entity, it would be staffed with and run by city officials.
This is the first one of its kind in California and is the second one in the country, right?
Right. There's a public bank in North Dakota, and that's been around, I believe, since the early 1900s. But that is a very, very different public bank, than I would say what LA is probably proposing to establish. The Bank of North Dakota has a very specific mission, and they actually work very collaboratively with financial institutions to fund projects. If you look at what proponents of a public bank, that traditional public bank model would look like here in California, in LA, it's not a collaborative relationship. It's taking deposits that currently are in existing financial institutions that the cities have put in there, removing those and putting them into a state-run entity.
So the funds and the accounts that this bank will have, it will be city's money sitting there. Is that what they're proposing?
That's right. So what we've understood would be the funding for this initial bank. They'd be taking deposits that up until the point of this Citibank's establishment has been in other traditional owned financial institutions.
And the proponents of this bank are saying they're going to save. That the city spending, is it $150 million a year in fees that they're going to save?
Yeah, I'm not sure the exact number, but I've heard that number, or that I would say that argument put forward from their side. Yes.
And is that possible to do with what you guys know on your side?
Well, I mean, the fees that financial institutions charge go for a number of different things to keep the bank operational. Compliance costs for a bank are sometimes 30 to 40% of their entire operating budget. So running a bank is extremely complicated. There's a number of both state, federal, financial rules that need to be followed. Banks get examined for safety and soundness every 18 months. And so, the fees that banks would be collecting go in a lot of times to pay for some of these compliance costs. And then also, for the state to say that they'd be saving this money, totally, I think, in my opinion, and in our industry's opinion, it is ignorant of the fact of how much it costs to actually run and stand up a bank.
And also, there's some talks about the interest that having this bank would allow the city to save. The proponents of this bank are saying that the city will save $1.1 billion of interest. Would having a bank help out with savings on the interest?
Well, I mean, if you look at, so, when you're paying interest, I mean, that's essentially going back into the bank and serves as the bank's funding source to fund additional loans. So, you're paying interest to borrow the money, and then the interest goes out from the bank in forms of other lending opportunities. So, for them to be saying that they'd be saving interest, I mean, I'm not quite sure how they're going to get the funds one, to be able to operationally stand up their bank and to do the type of lending that they've said they wanted to do.
And the city council just voted and approved this, right? Approved the study on it, right?
Correct. So they approved the city to go out, hire consultants to put this plan together. So what the bank would look like, kind of the startup costs, how it would run, and operationally and presumably how it would be managed.
Now, what do you think the impact would be if this bank is established and is operating in LA to this community of banks?
It depends. I mean, the bank, I'm not sure of all the financial institutions the city has deposits with, but to the extent they're pulling those deposits out of some of your smaller banks, that could potentially lead to less choice in the marketplace if those banks can't survive without that probably pretty significant amount of deposit money coming in from the city.
And what about the potential risks of operating a bank like that, with such a large bank, a city getting into it? What are the potential risks for whoever that's getting in without the experience?
Right. I mean, we think the risks are tremendous, and that, proponents of public banks have really kind of just brushed aside that this one very, I think, valid concern people should have when they think about the city establishing their own bank. One is, will they have the expertise and the knowledge to run a bank? Would it be free from political influence? That's always an issue when you get, governments involved in certain business organizations. And then three, when we had when we did polling, and then we heard from people in 2018 when they defeated the measure to establish a bank at that point in time, they didn't want the city getting involved in banking. They wanted the city to focus on measures that they felt were being neglected, whether it's homelessness, healthcare costs, probably a lot more issues now since we've had COVID-19.
And you mentioned it could be used for political purposes. Can you explain more on that? How?
Yeah, I mean, I think with any government entity, there's always a risk that it wouldn't be run free from political influence. So if somebody comes to the bank for a loan, maybe doesn't have the specific credit standards that they should probably have. If they're a political donor, or they know somebody at the bank, how free from political influence is a bank run by government officials going to be?
There seems to be some potential for this idea to do service to certain segments of the community in LA. But there's another side to this. When you mentioned that it could be used for political things, we have a problem in LA with corruption. We have a few city councilmen that have been indicted. What are your thoughts on that? If we had bad people in the government, we do have good people in the government, but if we had some bad people, would they be able to do something with this bank?
Right. I mean, I think that's definitely a concern when you're talking about an institution that is taking care of the taxpayers and taxpayer money and the fiduciary duty they have to those dollars. I think there's potential for corruption across a number of different entities, not just financial institutions. But I think when you're dealing with an entity that is run by officials, potentially those that are influenced by elected officials, there is that concern. The type of oversight that a bank like this might have, that's really unclear. So that has been a concern that we've identified in terms of possibly being politically influenced.
Now, if a bank like this gets established, do you think it would be subject to the same regulatory rules that the rest of the banks are in LA?
I mean, we would certainly hope so. That's one question that we've raised throughout this whole debate, is what would the regulatory regime look like for a government-run bank? That's been less than clear to us. To be honest, I think that's where we say that if that were to be the case, they were to be run like our banks are currently run, there'd be no way they'd be able to function and run like the proponents are out there advocating and saying they are.
How much transparency do you think a bank like this would have compared to your other financial institutions?
That's a great question. And again, I think that's one question we've asked, maybe not using the word transparency, but when we talk about what sort of regulatory framework a bank like this would operate under. We have bank examiners coming in pretty much every 18 months, looking at everything, looking through the books, looking at the loans we've made, looking at things we've messaged to the board. So from our perspective, we would think that any government or municipally run bank should and would have to follow under the same regulatory framework. But that is something that's unclear, and we have not yet heard what that would look like at all.
What about on the other side of it, where people, if you have a bank like this that the city owns, if a large depositor comes, maybe a large company or a foreign country coming and opening up a bank account and putting a lot of money in it, do you think this could be a way for people to influence the government officials in that city?